Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace. I'm Murray Mandrick, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post. And with me, as usual, Arthur White-Crummey, who is our legislative reporter for the Leader Post and Star Phoenix. And joining us, Stephanie Taylor, Canadian press reporter in Regina. You hear her on those press conferences all the time, asking those great questions. A lot of great questions to ask in the last week or so, because there's been a lot of news. So we're probably going to get into what the session coming up in a little while is going to look like, what the budget is going to look like, but lots of COVID-19 news from last week and this. So I'm going to start with you, Stephanie, because I think you were at both press conferences. I sensed a real difference in tone with Premier Scott Moe from last week, in which he was kind of blaming Justin Trudeau, the federal government, unusual for him, on the vaccine supply and everything else. I think it was a really more optimistic, forward-looking tone this week related to getting people out and getting vaccinated, with a lot of questions about the vaccine rollout and what may or may not happen. So can you give us a quick, brief rundown as to what happened on Tuesday in terms of the announcement and what we have to look forward to, I guess, in the coming weeks?
The big headline out of yesterday was Saskatchewan's possible shift to delay the second dose of vaccine for up to 4 months. Dr. Shahab and the Premier both say that by doing that, it would accelerate the amount of people who could get a first dose of vaccine. Dr. Shahab said that if Saskatchewan switches to that 4-month delay, it could be by the end of June that all adults in Saskatchewan get their first dose. And Premier Moe says that that's only with Pfizer and Moderna, but if we get more of Oxford AstraZeneca or we get Johnson & Johnson approved, that could be middle of June. So that's really some of the most optimistic news the Premier and the public health officer of this province have delivered for the past.
What are they saying in terms of? What are they saying in terms of? I'm just sorry to interrupt you, but what are they saying in terms of following the science here? Because that seems to be a big question that's being asked in regard to whether this 4-month delay is something that's appropriate or something to do. So can you explain to people who have concerns related to that as to whether this is a safe approach?
Well, I think it's worth saying that Saskatchewan has not indicated they're moving there. They're strongly hinting that they want to move there. But the province is waiting to see what a national committee of experts that looks at immunizations has to say and whether they would support a move like that. Dr. Shahab cited evidence coming from British Columbia or Quebec that isn't doing the full 4 months, but I think they might be around 90 days, that shows the first dose of vaccine to be quite effective against COVID-19. That effective enough that it allows people to be protected for a long enough period of time to warrant the second dose being delayed at a time when we are dealing with a bit of vaccine scarcity and just a difficult time because of just the way manufacturing or the lack of in this country, and we have to just get vaccines shipped to us. So, but the big point being is that Saskatchewan is kind of waiting to see what this committee of experts has to say, and it's unclear as to kind of what they're going to have to need to hear in order to move in that direction.
Sounds like Petey needs a dose right now. Petey's Stephanie's dog. You have to see Steph. If Petey comes along, we'll invite Petey onto the show because Petey is worth an appearance. Arthur, how much is Premier Scott Moe hanging the vaccine issue to his political strategy, I guess, as it were, in terms of how he wants the public to buy into this? There seems to be a lot right now from the Premier yesterday about the need to get vaccines in people's arms. 93% of the people in care homes and otherwise had or accepted the vaccine, but there seems to be reluctance. I think as you get into you younger people, not like us seniors, you younger people, there might be even more reluctance for people to take the vaccine. And I actually think Premier Scott Moe was probably talking to them yesterday in terms of that. Did you get a sense of that? And can you sort of explain to the public as to why he might be messaging that right now?
Well, I think vaccines have been at the center of Scott Moe's political strategy since really the beginning of 2021 or even shortly before. It's always been the light at the end of the tunnel that he uses to call upon people to make the sacrifices that we've all been making. And now that we have a very large percentage of vulnerable long-term care residents vaccinated, it's now going to be a justification, it seems, for moving away from some of those restrictions. We heard, I think, the clearest statement yet that we're very soon going to see a certain degree of loosening, starting with the private gathering restrictions that limit you to your immediate family for the most part. So that's going to be reviewed right now, and we could see a change announced as early as next week. So really, vaccines are really what he's been hinging his political fortunes on. We heard again and again that Saskatchewan has one of the fastest programs in the country in terms of getting the vaccines that are delivered to the province into people's arms. So I think that's going to continue to be a gauge of success and something that the Premier wants people to look at when they're assessing his record, more so than necessarily the case numbers and some of those more questionable metrics.
Steph, let's frame that notion of whether it's safe or not to proceed with any loosening of restrictions, because there's a twofold problem. One of which is getting people to continue on with the current restrictions because people are COVID fatigued. We're getting into a year of this and they're tired. But the other problem is we're not going down as quickly as maybe some people would like. We're still hovering around the 140, 150 cases per day based on the 7-day average. As I think Arthur outlined, because we're getting vaccines to seniors, we're going to see a lessening of the death toll, hopefully. And I think that was apparent in January. There was 151 deaths in January compared to, I think, 85 in February, if my numbers are right, which is a substantial reduction. And obviously good news for the province. Two things. Does the Premier now pivot to basically talking about the success of reducing the death toll, reducing cases? How does he sell the notion of being able to open up the province, and how does he sell it in relation to young people who might go a little wild, a little crazy after being clamped down for at least since mid-December in terms of some of their gathering restrictions? How problematic politically and policy-wise is that for the Sask Party government and Premier Scott Moe right now?
Yesterday, Premier Moe and Dr. Shahab kind of outlined 3 indicators for their rationale of possibly loosening restrictions, one of which being a stabilizing of case numbers. And as you say, a lot of people are saying, well, they're stabilizing at a pretty high rate. I think 140, 150 is kind of what we've turned our weekly 7-day average of new daily cases into. But because experts are saying, vaccines are getting into people's arms the most vulnerable, we should start to see our deaths and severe illnesses coming down. And we have seen a bit of a decreased pressure on the acute care system and stabilization, and even decrease of hospitalizations. As well, we saw the Chief Medical Health Officer kind of break it down as to where the problematic regions are in the province, and mentioning that, there's outbreaks in Regina in the north and north central, but the further south and even Saskatoon has seen some improvements. As well, the vaccine supply is some of the rationale for, or it seems to be some of the rationale for potentially loosening restrictions. Not just the fact that this stuff is getting into people's arms, but that there is this steady supply, which provides a bit more certainty that more of the most vulnerable and more of the general public eventually are going to start to actually get some extra protection against COVID-19. I think there's still going to be risks, and the government is going to have to answer the questions you're asking, Murray, as to what risks are you willing to take? How wide are you willing to see things open? The Premier has said that this isn't going to be a throwing off of all the restrictions, but the loosening of some. Primarily, his focus seems to be around households and allowing some way for people to have visitors over, because we haven't been able to do that since before Christmas. But questions about what happens with the variant, what happens if spread increases, what if there is another delay in terms of the distribution of the vaccines or something on the manufacturing side, which we saw earlier this year. These are all the questions the Premier is going to have to deal with. and touting how quickly the vaccine gets into people's arms, I think may not be the answer to all of the questions that people might be asking if we start to move down the path of lifting some of the restrictions we have now.
And as you point out, the restrictions haven't been have been consistent across the province, but the COVID-19 problem hasn't. And Arthur, I'm going to ask you this because you specifically looked into why Regina's cases as of late have been higher than most places. And a lot of people are wondering that. I don't know if I particularly understand it as per the explanation I've gotten from Dr. Shahab and otherwise. So can you enlighten me and everybody else in terms of why it is over particularly the last month and a half, Regina has seen a steady rise in cases compared with other jurisdictions, up to and including Saskatoon, that was a problem area before, but certainly is less now. I don't get it. I don't really understand perfectly why our cases are high, because there doesn't seem to be any one individual thing that's causing this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a fully satisfying answer, Murray, because at this point,
you haven't got one, yeah.
It's still largely speculative.
Yeah.
Certainly, we've seen the trends reversing over the majority of this pandemic. Saskatoon has had more daily cases and more active cases than Regina, but over the past couple weeks, since about February 18th or so, that is reversed, and we've seen an uptick in Regina and a downturn in Saskatoon, to the point where now in active cases per capita, Regina is at about nearly twice what Saskatoon has. The thing is, I talked to a few public health experts, a few epidemiologists, and there was some speculation that this could be related to the variant. We've seen a few more variant cases down in Regina than in Saskatoon, but it's really only a handful that we're going on here. The thing that is a bit more troubling is that the Regina cases have not been linked to any travelers. We don't really know where they came from, which suggests that there may be some community spread of the UK variant, but it's still very preliminary. And they made these comments with a lot of caution, saying it could be anything. It could even be purely random, based on a few outbreaks can lead to localized flare-ups that then subside, and that's not always fully predictable. So really, the problem here is that we're still a little bit behind in getting the results for these variant cases. We just got the ability to sequence it in-house here in the province. Before then, we were waiting weeks to get the results back from Winnipeg. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll have more information to explain these trends in the future.
Well, one thing he's definitely doing is not avoiding the legislature to cause a super spreader event in terms of the session. We're delayed until April 6th for the budget. And for those that don't normally follow this, that's about 2-3 weeks, maybe a month longer in terms of a session delay than normal. That means less scrutiny. That means having to govern through special warrants, and it means probably not maybe being able to examine the budget quite as thoroughly as we normally do. Let's start with the special warrants, and generally, I think people understand that that's Cabinet's ability to spend money when there isn't a budget, which sometimes happens. But Arthur, you did a story about how much money and what's it for. How worried should the public be about this? Because it is somewhat an unusual thing. What's less usual is having a budget delay as long as we've had it, not in just this province, but across the country. And we'll probably get into that in a moment. But let's talk about the special warrants for COVID-19 and other things, and what they're spending money on and what they're doing in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure people should be especially worried. This is not altogether out of the ordinary. I remember this time last year, I believe there was also a package of special warrants with a fairly hefty sum. This one is big enough. It's $320 million, and that's spending that wasn't allocated to certain ministries in the 2020-2021 budget. So they're now coming looking for additional money because they've exceeded what they were allocated back in June. A lot of it's going to health. which is the biggest single ministry. A bit more is going to highways as well. But a lot of it, especially for health and justice, is coming out of that COVID contingency fund that we heard about when the budget was tabled. So again, no surprise there. That's paying for the majority of the added spending, and now it's been totally drawn down. So none of this is especially unexpected, and I think people should be a bit more worried about what's coming on April 6th, and I'm sure you and Steph have a lot to talk about that.
Well, and I think that is the good point. The issue here is more of a global overall one, because we just got through an election. Much of the campaign was run on the notion of which party was going to balance the budget and was offering more of a responsible fiscal agenda. And the NDP took a significant political hit, really didn't gain any seats. And I think one of the reasons why is a concern about a disjointed financial plan that they were presenting, where they were spending significantly more money than the Sask party was proposing, with no plans in the next 4 years by 2024 to balance the budget. Well, lo and behold, guess what we find out, Steph? Your conversation with Finance Minister Donna Harpower kind of suggested that the government, even though they were promising during the election campaign of a balanced budget by 2024 with the pandemic and everything else, which could be reasonable, probably has to alter those plans. What did she tell you, and what is the government line right now in terms of selling that notion?
So the Minister of Finance says it's going to be very, very difficult to eliminate the $2 billion or forecast the $2 billion deficit by the stated 2024 goal. And when pressed on it, says, we still are waiting for some of the final projections to come in, but the way things are looking, in all good likelihood, we're going to have to pick a new target. We have not seen the work that is really back up the statement as what the projections are actually looking like. But she is citing a slower than anticipated economic recovery from COVID-19, not just in Saskatchewan, but beyond. And also citing the fact that the Saskatchewan Party government wants to be there to provide people services and is not interested in making irresponsible decisions for the sake of a goal. And yesterday, Premier Moe did not indicate how much longer the government might be running deficits or what the new target might be. But again, kind of brought out this line and explanation of, we are going to be there to provide services for residents, and we're not going to do anything to jeopardize our economic recovery and efforts to bring back the thousands of jobs that have been lost during the pandemic. And that more details about a back to balance plan are going to be presented on budget day. It was interesting talking to the finance minister, because she said and suggested that people want to see the government have a plan, but not make irresponsible decisions for the sake of necessarily achieving that goal, which I would be interested to know how that sits with maybe some of the more hawkish supporters of the Saskatchewan Party about, is having a plan good enough, or do you want to see a government actually deliver the finished product, which is a balanced budget? But I don't think it's entirely unsurprising that in the time of a global pandemic, health costs are up because of overtime, because there is a larger priority that we need to start growing the economy again, or that's what the Premier stated he wants to do, that the government might be looking at things and saying, this is maybe not a time we want to be tightening our belts all that much or making cuts or other unpopular political decisions at a time when so many people are looking at the government to see what supports they have up.
Yeah, and responsible decisions or responsible choices are in the eyes of the beholder. And I think the SGI rebate, well, we all love it. Love to get an SGI rebate. Love to get a break on my power bill, my Sask power bill, because it always is high. Great choices, great selling points in an election campaign. But are they really the right thing in the middle of a pandemic when, as Stephanie points out, we got added health costs, we got a lot of added things. And one thing I really don't get is we're not getting a great revenue explanation as to why we are off course from whatever their budget projections were during the election and otherwise. Can you speak to that, Arthur? Because we're seeing oil prices go up, we're seeing a few other things. What's the framing of the budget debate going to be like once the session returns on April 6th?
Yeah, this makes it very, very interesting to me because I cannot really understand what has changed markedly since the time of the election when they made that 4-year balanced budget commitment. And now, I certainly can't see what's changed between the mid-year report and now to justify taking us off course. Really, like you said, oil prices have largely recovered. They're over $60 a barrel US right now. There's no word on whether that's going to remain for the long term, but certainly it's far better than we were expecting, and that is a major source of revenue for the provincial government. Further, I haven't seen any private sector forecasts that lead me to believe that that we're off course in terms of GDP recovery. So I don't see where sales taxes and also income are going to take a significant hit. So we'll be asking those questions on April 6th when we get to see the finished product. But as of now, I think there's a lot of questions about transparency and what the government knew when they made that commitment.
There we go. I think too, there are questions that I have about how much of this softening of that deficit goal is a bit of a communication strategy as well, and that pinning yourself to something and having this and pinning yourself to a goal followed by an expectation that you are going to make this regimented march. Perhaps the government is thinking they don't want to lock themselves into something because there is still so much uncertainty, or because the opposition throughout the campaign trail and now is criticizing them for not spending enough to help people, while there are examples of people hurting and the economy not, being the best it's ever been, or the difficulty to grow it to what some of the premier's goals are in his kind of wide-ranging aspirational growth plan. So I wonder if some of the change on the deficit is maybe not necessarily because of the numbers, but because the government perhaps wants a little bit more flexibility and to quell any fears in people's minds that this could be a repeat of the 2017 budget when there was a back to balance plan and people saw what that actually meant when it came down to kind of getting the books in line.
Absolutely. Hey, you know what a great place to debate this? Hey, how about the legislature? It seems empty right now, and it shouldn't be in March. And hopefully by the time in a month from now, we'll see a better explanation to all this. I guess we'll have to cut this short because we could talk about this all day. Stephanie Taylor, Canadian Press, thank you so much. Arthur White-Crummey, Leader Post, Star Phoenix, thanks for your input. And we'll see you again on Inside the Marble Palace.